I asked everyone I interviewed what their thoughts were on anti-fascism and free speech, and I think that the answers that I got can be divided into two main perspectives. The first perspective is that anti-fascism is not against free speech because when we talk about the First Amendment, that's a governmental protection against speech. Anti-fascists are not the government. Anti-fascists are not calling on the government to censor anyone. They're mobilizing against fascist organizing, not speech per se. If a random individual says some crazy stuff, that's not necessarily the focus of what they're doing. It's against organizing. That's sort of one perspective that I heard articulated frequently. Another perspective was no free speech for fascists, and stop. So those are the two different perspectives, but they're sort of united in the rejection of the liberal framing of the question, which to me is the main takeaway, which is that if we see the struggle against fascism as a political struggle, and we do not concede to fascism or white supremacy the status of being a respectable opinion, and we don't see the struggle as sort of creating a regime of rights where neo-Nazis and their victims coexist and have a reasonable dialogue, if we see the goal as eradicating these politics, then that, in my mind and the mind of the anti-fascists I spoke to, changes the equation and means that the goal is not to sort of think about what these kinds of rights should be, but rather how do we eradicate these politics. So that's sort of, I mean, in some countries it's more important than others. So I have a chapter about the free speech question. And I gave the book to a reader from Austria, and he's like, why do you have a whole chapter about free speech? This is not really the point. And I said, I understand that, but this is a book for Americans. But I've spoken to people in the Netherlands who say that actually, maybe in the 90s it wasn't such a big deal, but starting in the 2000s, for reasons that are too long to explain, it started to be a big deal. So it changes. The Greeks I spoke to were absolutely incredulous that that's even a consideration. So, you know, it depends. A few things, though, that I think are worth adding is that there's an assumption that we have, quote-unquote, full free speech right now. But there are all sorts of restrictions on speech, whether it be libel or obscenity or copyright infringement or corporate license and so forth, all sorts of restrictions. And so the notion that we have this absolutist free speech that's being infringed upon, of course, is not actually true. And in a capitalist society, when we think about stratification of speech, the notion that speech is completely free is ludicrous. There's all sorts of layers I get into. Ultimately, those are the two perspectives, but I think they're united by a rejection of the liberal framing of the question and by seeing it as a political struggle rather than sort of a management of rights.